friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
I thought it over and over and over. But I can't go through it again.
Honey, I'm going to tell you something. You can believe it or not, but it's the truth. The last winter of the war, over in Germany, for 30 days and nights we took a steady beating. More than half my platoon were killed. I never expected to come out alive. But that was nothing to the beating I've taken these last 30 days and nights. Oh, I'm just a mug. I can't say the things the way I'd like to, but... Well, honey, I've learned a brutal lesson. I've got wise to myself. And the score adds up to this. You're all there is for me.
That was the original 1949 screen test for then-newcomer Rock Hudson. And on this special episode of How the West Was Cast, we'll discuss some of our favorite Rock Hudson westerns and what makes them so special. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, before we continue, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us about your favorite Rock Hudson westerns, or suggest some other stars you'd like us to talk about on a future show. Okay then, Andrew, why don't you introduce us to the subject of today's episode?
So today we're talking about Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson. The name oozes machismo, and that was the point. As the story goes, the moniker was devised by Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, as a combination of the Rock of Gibraltar and the Hudson River. Hudson was born Roy Shearer in 1925 in Winnetka, Illinois, north of Chicago. He fell in love with movies and acting as a boy, and after a stint in the Navy during World War II, moved to Los Angeles. There he found work as a truck driver, but spent most of his time lingering outside the gates of the major Hollywood studios, passing out headshots in hope of landing a break. That break came in 1948, when he caught Wilson's attention. Wilson was one of Hollywood's most powerful agents, and his knack for inventing manly names was surpassed by his eye for masculine talent. Guy Madison, Ty Hardin, Tab Hunter, Troy Donahue were all among the large stable of attractive young clients whom he nurtured and promoted, and often exploited to his own ends. Hudson was signed to a long-term contract at Universal International Pictures. Though he struck a dashing figure, Hudson was clumsy, and he had a lot of trouble remembering his lines. Intense instruction in acting, singing, dancing, fencing, and horseback riding were ordered, in the hope that, with work, his acting talent could at least come close to matching his handsome looks. The work paid off. Within a few years, Hudson had graduated from bit and supporting parts to leading roles in as many as 4 films a year. Almost all of these were adventure movies of one type or another. War pictures, seafaring tales, Arabian fantasies, and, of course, westerns, which were a staple of Universal's low and mid-budget productions, which was, in fact, what Universal, one of the so-called minor studios of the 8 that still dominated the industry, specialized in. A third of Hudson's early films were westerns, including some by the genre's greatest filmmakers, like Anthony Mann, Bud Boetticher, and Raoul Walsh. Yet the western seldom, if ever, comes up in discussions of Hudson's career. It's not hard to see why. Mann's Winchester 73 and Bend of the River are celebrated westerns, but Hudson has only supporting roles in them. Walsh's The Lawless Breed and Gun Fury don't rank with The Big Trail or Pursued in appraisals of either his career or the western film. Likewise, Boetticher's Horizons West and Seminole, relative to films like The Tall T or Ride Lonesome. In short, most of Hudson's 50s westerns are largely forgotten, but that's also the case with nearly all of Hudson's early films. Why? Because the actor's rise to being one of Hollywood's most popular stars corresponded with a change in the types of movies he made. We remember Hudson for his work in other genres, in melodramas, particularly those directed by Douglas Sirk, and romantic comedies, especially those co-starring Doris Day. Following his breakout performance in Sirk's 1954 romance Magnificent Obsession, Hudson largely left action films behind. And when roles for him in melodramas and romantic comedies began to dry up in the mid-1960s, perhaps because Hudson's relatively advanced age was at odds with the more progressive masculinity he represented, he seldom returned to them, even as many of his contemporaries retreated to familiar genre terrain. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the Western in particular became a refuge of sorts for aging male stars. John Wayne, first and foremost, but also others, Gregory Peck, Burt Lancaster, Jimmy Stewart, Robert Mitchum. Hudson returned to the Western only 3 times, for The Last Sunset in 1961, The Undefeated in 1969, and Showdown in 1973. Hudson's performances are the highlights of these films. He was clearly at ease in the Western, so why didn't he make more of them? A possible reason is that Hudson's persona was fundamentally at odds with aspects of the Western, and in particular the more traditional expressions of the Western that endured throughout the 1960s and 70s. Though Hudson exuded manliness in countless ways, his charm, his looks, his physicality, the actor achieved his greatest acclaim in roles that criticized, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, old-fashioned ideas about masculinity. Hudson's character is often the man who needs to learn a lesson, who needs to change with the times. Yet this is often the opposite of what the conventional Western hero does. He precipitates the change, but then leaves, knowing he doesn't have a place in the new state of affairs he's helped bring into being. Critics have an understandable tendency to read Hudson's movies in light of his life as a closeted gay man, whose secret was, by most accounts, known in Hollywood throughout his career, but not by the wider public until very near the end of it. Many of Hudson's roles are, indeed, about men struggling with their identities, torn between two worlds. And yet, these were popular dramatic devices in post-war Hollywood. Conflicted, insecure protagonists, men especially, were common, if not the norm. A reflection, many critics argue, of the complications of trying to reassert traditional ways of life following the traumas of the Second World War. The Western itself is often the story of a man stuck between two worlds, between past and present, East and West, order and anarchy, wilderness and civilization. This may help explain why the genre achieved its greatest popularity in the 2 decades following the war. Now, as listeners of the podcast know, I love to harp on the need to look beyond the canon of great films and rediscover the richness and diversity of the Western, especially at the height of its popularity. Rock Hudson's Westerns provide us with just such an opportunity. They tell us a lot about the genre and about American cinema more generally.
Now, for this episode, we've each chosen 3 Rock Hudson Westerns that we think are well worth recommending. Most of these films are available to stream on Amazon and YouTube, and a couple of them have recently been released on Blu-ray in beautiful special editions from Kino Lorber. So if they sound interesting to you, be sure to check them out and let us know what you think. Okay then, Andrew, what's your first pick?
My first pick today is Seminole from 1953. It was directed by Bud Boetticher and co-stars Barbara Hale, Anthony Quinn, and Richard Carlson, as well as Hugh O'Brien and Lee Marvin in smaller roles. The film is a highly fictionalized account of the Second Seminole War that began in 1835, when, under the authority of the Indian Removal Act, the United States Army was charged with removing the Seminole tribe from their lands in Florida and relocating them to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. Hudson plays Lieutenant Lance Caldwell, a man who grew up in Florida and knows the Seminole culture and language. Quinn plays the Seminole leader Osceola, a childhood friend of Caldwell's. Carlson chews scenery in the best possible way as Caldwell's arrogant superior, Major Deegan, who has never lost a battle and who foolishly believes that conventional warfare will triumph over the Seminole in the swamps of Florida. Now, given the Florida setting, Seminole isn't really a Western, though it's a film very much of its time. Films like Fort Apache in 1948 and Broken Arrow in 1950 inaugurated a cycle of Indian-themed Westerns, many of which depicted native peoples and customs with greater complexity than earlier movies. Fort Apache, Broken Arrow, and subsequent pictures, White Feather, The Indian Fighter, Run of the Arrow, all feature a character type the cultural historian Richard Slotkin has famously termed the man who knows Indians. This is the white hero who, either by upbringing or proving himself through trials, is able to both think and fight like an Indian. With Seminole, Hudson capably takes his place alongside almost every other leading man of the 50s who at some point played this character. Seminole is among the least discussed of director Bedeker's movies, which is a shame because I think there's a lot to like in it. It offers some effective variations on the man who knows Indian story, as both Caldwell and Osceola, who was half white, grapple with competing allegiances and also compete for the love of Barbara Hale's character Revere. Much of the action was shot on location in the Florida Everglades, and the film takes full advantage of its exotic settings. The highlight of the movie is a tense, nearly 30-minute-long sequence midway through the film that has Caldwell, Deegan, and their men march out into the steamy swampland in search of Osceola and his people. The oppressive heat and humidity is palpable as sweat beads on the characters' faces, and they struggle, mostly in vain, through the dense foliage and dangerous marshes. It's a remarkable sequence of characters moving through dangerous territory of the sort Bedeker is now known for.
That sequence is so brilliant. I'm glad you brought it up. This movie was so great, and I hadn't seen it before the podcast, so I'm really glad you picked it. Yeah, the long sequence in the swamp when the soldiers are stalking the Seminoles, it's my favorite part in the movie. It's especially the fact that we see Rock dive into a pool of quicksand to save somebody. Yeah. Any movie that features quicksand immediately rises to the top of my favorite films. There's something about that. I think we've lost the magic of a quicksand in modern films.
Yeah, it doesn't have the threat that it once did. I can remember being, as a child, genuinely scared of quicksand, but I suppose that's a collective fear we've gotten over.
It felt like for a while that half of every swamp was just full of quicksand waiting to eat you. And one of the cool things about that sequence is it reminds me of this Walter Hill film from 1981 called Southern Comfort with Powers Booth and Keith Carradine as National Guardsmen who go into the Louisiana Bayou. And they end up coming under fire from a bunch of crazy Cajuns who think that they're invading their territory. And just like in Seminole, a bunch of the characters start going crazy in Southern Comfort, or they get sick from, the swampland, and it has that same kind of survival action quality to it.
Yeah, I mean, also the same message of underestimating your adversary. I mean, Deegan is in some ways a Custer type character who's done in by his own hubris, but what I really like is the way the Seminole are portrayed as essentially guerrilla-like, which is historical. Fighting from trees, camouflaging themselves. It's a really stark contrast. It's more contrast than what we sometimes see when the conventional cavalry officer leads his men out into the plains and there's a kind of a battle between Indians. This is novel in that respect.
You're definitely right too about Richard Carlson. He's so great as the villain. He also bears this uncanny resemblance to Phil Hartman from SNL.
Great point.
I put two photos of them up side by side, and it was hard to tell which was which. Yeah. The love triangle in the film, like in a lot of westerns of this period, is probably the least interesting part of it, at least for me. I think Rock is so much better in this movie when he's butting heads with Richard Carlson, or when he's admonishing soldiers who accidentally shoot Indians. His rage comes across much better than his romantic charm in this film.
I agree with that, and there's almost an implicit acknowledgement of that by the film because Barbara Hale's character basically disappears for about 45 minutes worth, and the film's narrative thrust becomes a little bit confusing. You're wondering when they're going to weave these two chains of action back together, and they ultimately do because it is a Hollywood film. But I totally agree with you that the most compelling part is the company of men and the internal conflict as well as the conflict with the Seminole. It's
bookended by these court-martial scenes that have that sort of a few good men quality to them, which I love. And the final, I guess we'll give it away. The final rescue of Rock is really cool when the Seminoles turn around and they're all right there. They've been
the whole time
visible the whole time. We just haven't noticed them. It's a great ending. I really love this. It's interesting to see Rock get better during this movie. He starts off, I think, a little awkward, and then it gradually, as the plot goes along, he seems to fall in line, and his anger comes out more realistically. And that feels sort of like Rock's career in general. I think the more films he made, the more comfortable he started looking. Early on, he has that deer in the headlights quality to some of his performances where he's still figuring out if he can do this. And he's so much more relaxed later on and finds his groove in movies in the 60s and 70s. So this movie sort of mirrors that in its own structure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think watching all of these early Westerns now, you get a sense of a guy who clearly had the potential to bring it, but just didn't have the capacity to summon it on demand. And I assume that working with directors like Bedecker or Raoul Walsh helped him begin to hone that craft. But I agree, it's a study in potential, and there are those moments where he's called upon to draw on this kind of reserve of anger that's part of the character. Those are when he really excels in these early films, I think.
Rock Hudson as Lieutenant Caldwell.
But I know their language, sir. Their customs. Perhaps if I talk to this Osceola.
The talking days are over.
The girl, Barbara Hale. Her loyalties divided as her heart was divided.
Major, I've been brought here without any explanation.
The proud chief Osceola, Anthony Quinn. Major Deegan, Richard Carlson, who lusted for victory with the intensity of a madman.
I suffered a disaster at the hands of this Osceola, the first disaster of my career. Now he becomes my prisoner.
You've lost all sense of honor and decency.
All right, Matt, so that's my first pick. What's your first Rock Hudson recommendation?
My first film is Bend of the River, released by Universal Pictures in 1952. It was directed by Anthony Mann and stars Jimmy Stewart, Arthur Kennedy, Julie Adams, and Rock Hudson. Loosely based on a novel called Bend of the Snake by historian Bill Gullick, the screenplay was written by Borden Chase, who wrote some of the greatest westerns of the 1950s, including Red River and Winchester 73. In Bend of the River, Stewart plays Glyn McClintock, a former border raider, which is a polite way to say that he was a member of a violent domestic terror group operating in Missouri and Kansas during the Civil War. When we first meet him in the film, he's leading a wagon train of settlers to Oregon in 1866. While on a scouting mission, Glyn discovers a lynching in progress and impulsively rescues Emerson Cole, a strung-up horse thief played by Arthur Kennedy. Cole is also a former raider, and he and Glyn bond over their secret pasts. Later, when the wagon train rolls into Portland to buy supplies for the winter, they meet up with Trey Wilson, a charming professional gambler played by Rock Hudson. Complications ensue when the settlers are cheated out of their supplies by a greedy businessman, forcing Glyn to steal the items back again, which triggers a series of violent confrontations and eventually pits Glyn and Cole against each other in a fight to the death. Bend of the River was the second of 8 movies that Stewart made with Anthony Mann, and I think it's one of their most entertaining films. It's a psychological western that incorporates elements of film noir to great effect. Stewart's hero is a man haunted by a guilty past. He's desperate to keep his ugly secret hidden from the settlers who put their trust in him, and throughout the film he spends as much time fighting his own inner demons as he does battling Indians and murderous thugs. Kennedy, meanwhile, is absolutely terrific, playing Stewart's sneering doppelganger. When we first meet him, he seems like a playful rogue, but as the film continues, his mask begins to slowly fall away, revealing the conniving criminal lurking beneath it. The relationship between these two former outlaws, one repentant, the other repellent, is the main source of dramatic conflict in the movie, and Stewart and Kennedy play it up brilliantly. Now, Rock Hudson's role is not nearly as dramatic here, but it does add another layer to the story. With his fine clothing and million-watt smile, Hudson's character is purposely soft. Although quick on the draw, he lacks the killer instinct of Glynn and Cole, opting instead to wound an opponent early on rather than shoot him dead. It's a solid supporting turn for Hudson, drawing on his likability and his romantic charm. On a technical level, Bend of the River is a very special film. Mann, as always, is a master at crafting suspense, and the movie features several jump-out-of-your-seat moments, including one of my favorite Indian arrow hits. There's a scene where Julie Adams takes a surprise arrow in the shoulder that makes me gasp whenever I see it. The combination of special effects and the quick edit and that thwap sound effect really are just wonderful. Minutes later, when Glynn and Cole hunt the group of Indians who fired that arrow, Mann pulls out all the stops, delivering a masterful suspense sequence. I love the moment during it when two feathers slowly rise up in the foreground and begin silently creeping towards Glynn, who's unaware that he's being tracked. It's really a chilling moment. Honestly, when we decided to do an episode on the westerns of Rock Hudson, Bend of the River was the very first title I thought of. It's just that good.
Yeah, common way of thinking about the history of the Western is these great director-star pairings, so whether it's Wayne and Ford or Wayne and Hawks or Bud Bedecker and Randolph Scott, and then, of course, Anthony Mann and Jimmy Stewart. So this is the second of the Westerns that they made together. Each one, as you said, in some way is about a lonely man driven to, let's say, extremes of physical and mental torment as he hunts those who are in some way responsible for a personal tragedy in his dark past. Now, I have to say that I am not a great fan of the neurotic persona that Jimmy Stewart began to develop in the 1950s and then carried into the early 1960s, which probably culminated in Vertigo. And that's partly why I prefer Anthony Mann's Westerns without Stewart. So Devil's Doorway, The Furies, The Tin Star, Man of the West. This is earlier in the Mann-Stewart cycle, though, so I think it strikes a little bit of a better balance than maybe The Naked Spur, The Man from Laramie.
Is it that you don't believe those moments coming from him, or what is it about this?
Right. I do. I find it really a little bit grating. Now, it's a choice because it's very different than his performances in the 30s and 40s, and it's also different than the more kind of grandfatherly persona that he began to take on, the more laconic persona, let's say, he began to take on in the late 1960s. So it's clearly a choice, and I understand it's in keeping with the time. But as I said, I find it a little bit grating, especially as the 50s wear on and the 60s take hold.
For the first half of the film, the first time I saw it, I had no idea that Cole was going to turn out to be a villain. I thought he might be just his violent buddy who, is there to do the dirty work and maybe dies nobly in the last second. So when that moment actually comes up and we realize who he really is, it took me for a surprise on the first viewing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the rare film that withholds that kind of information from us. I mean, normally there would be a musical theme or some kind of hint, or there would be an aside or a little scene that Stewart's character wouldn't be privy to, but that we would be, that gives us more information. So we're just waiting for the reveal. But it's a genuine surprise in this movie. And I think it works to the film's effects too, and does help to explain how unbalanced Stewart becomes in the last half of the movie.
We also get some colorful supporting roles from Harry Morgan and Royal Dano, who's in a few of the films we're going to be talking about today. Yeah. Though perhaps the less said about Stephen Fetchett's character, the better. It is what it is.
Also, Julie Adams, who's great in this. She also stars opposite Hudson in a couple of later films, Horizons West and The Lawless Breed, before she, reaches her peak in The Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Like always in these films, the scenery is stunning. The Pacific Northwest looks beautiful. But one of the things I like about it, too, in this one is the nighttime sets when they shoot on a studio. The lighting in those sequences is so beautiful here that we get this stark moonlight, especially during those early scenes where Stewart and Kennedy are hunting the Indians through the little woods nearby. The lighting in those sequences, I just love that.
I agree with that. I mean, another thing that I really like about the movie is the aspect ratio. This is something that we rarely talk about, and we think about the Western in terms of widescreen, but I think there's really something to be said for the mature Academy ratio film in general, but Western in particular, that by this point they had really mastered Western composition, and with the introduction of the widescreen frame just a few years later, it actually kind of throws things off for a little bit. And Mann's widescreen compositions in The Naked Spur are lauded by many, but I actually find them a little bit awkward compared to some of the compositions we see in a movie like this.
Starring James Stewart as Glenn McClintock, Indian fighter, trailblazer, a tower of strength in the wilderness.
Come on, keep going. Yes,
Arthur Kennedy, whose smile hid the desperation of a hunted man. Julia Adams, who made the mistake of loving two men. Rock Hudson, who gambled with cards and with lives. You're fired.
My second film is Taza, Son of Cochise from 1954. It is the third film in a unofficial trilogy about the life of Chiricahua Apache chief Cochise that includes Broken Arrow and the Battle of Apache Pass. Jeff Chandler plays Cochise in each film. This movie opens with the death of Cochise, who passes the title of chief to his son Taza, played by Hudson. The good Indian versus bad Indian subplot of the earlier films here takes center stage as Taza struggles for power against Geronimo, who defies the new chief's plan to honor his father's wishes and live peacefully on a reservation. This makes Taza, Son of Cochise, the rare 50s Western to make the Indian, rather than his white ally, the protagonist. Other films in this minor tradition include 1950's Devil's Doorway, starring Robert Taylor, and another 1954 release, Apache, starring Burt Lancaster. Like those films, Taza, Son of Cochise goes farther than the average Indian Western in suggesting that the differences between Indians and whites are irreconcilable. Taza, Son of Cochise is mostly remembered today as an oddity, but not because of Hudson's red-faced performance in the lead. Hudson had, after all, played an Indian before in Winchester 73, and while Taza and films like it made sincere efforts to redress the overt racism of many earlier Hollywood movies, no Indian actors at this time were seen by the studios as being capable of carrying lead roles. Such are the contradictions of history. So, no, what's really odd about Taza, Son of Cochise, is that it was directed by Douglas Sirk. Sirk, who fled Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, is famous for his melodramas like All That Heaven Allows, Written on the Wind, and Imitation of Life, which were popular at the time and later came to be celebrated by critics as compelling critiques of the values of bourgeois American society. Taza, Son of Cochise, is Sirk's only Western, which is indeed notable. And yes, the Arizona Territory is about as far from the Connecticut suburbs as you can get. Yet, there are some continuities. Taza, Son of Cochise is a beautiful film, lensed in subdued colors that lend it a naturalism lacking from many color westerns. I've always been struck by the film's consistent use of low-angle framings, which emphasize the presence of the blue sky and also create multiple layers of action within the frame. This attention to staging is all the more impressive when it is viewed in 3D, which is now possible at home thanks to Kino Lorber's new Blu-ray release. A common criticism of Taza, Son of Cochise is that Hudson was miscast. This is overstated, I think. Hudson's performance as Taza does not match the stoic authority of Chandler's Cochise, but it isn't meant to. Taza is younger, conflicted, and faces pressures to assimilate that his father never did. In spite of needing to conform to Hollywood Indian performance standards, like the stilted, formal dialogue, Hudson manages to convey the heavy burdens of leadership, and the frustration of being subject to forces beyond one's control, one of Cirque's signature themes.
It's a great movie. The 3D stuff is really fun. I couldn't watch it in 3D.
Sure.
Were you able to?
Yes, I still have a 3D TV and
Wow.
a 3D Blu-ray player, so it is great. I also watched Gun Fury in 3D, so this is Hudson's second 3D Western. And, Cirque stated that he found the 3D a nuisance, but in spite of that, he does some really interesting things. I mean, there are, of course, the standard throwing things at the camera or the moments where a character is threatening and looks directly at the camera. But the staging in depth with, multiple layers of either props or costumes or people, it really made me appreciate why that low camera position was a conscious decision. So it really is quite a treat in 3D.
I'm a sucker for things being thrown at the camera. I know it's not very sophisticated, but this one has some very good boulders and spear action.
Yes.
The spears alone are worth the price of admission. We also get a bunch of really well choreographed hand-to-hand combat scenes throughout this film. It really does play as a straight-up contemporary action movie a lot of times. Something about Taza's persona, this no-nonsense, humorless action hero, seems very modern to me.
Yeah.
Oftentimes with the 3D in this film too, we get flat scenes or scenes that would normally just have no depth, and Cirque puts random tree branches in the way to sort of create something to play off of. My favorite one of those moments is he puts a giant dead fox right up towards the camera, and everything behind it creates this depth. It's a fun little trick he uses.
Yeah, in one of the wiki-ups. Yeah, there's great moments throughout this movie. I mean, this was a kind of do or die moment for 3D. If you look at a lot of the advertising for this film, it makes clear that finally all of the problems with 3D have been solved. This is the 3D film that you'd been waiting for. But this, of course, comes at the tail end of the 3D craze.
There are also some long wordless sequences here that are just told visually, and I love those. There's the nighttime raid on Fort Apache is done almost sans dialogue. The same sequence where Taza hunts down his brother is all just done through pure imagery, maybe because they didn't want to have to keep using that Tarzan-like broken English, so Cirque just shows us what's happening. It does have a narrator occasionally that pops in and does a little voiceover, but it's wholly unnecessary. But those wordless sequences, I think, are really one of his strong points. One interesting thing about the Blu-ray, though, was that it includes an intermission.
Yeah.
Now, that seemed a little odd because the movie is like less than 80 minutes long,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure what that was put in there for. Do you know?
I have no idea. I haven't listened to the commentary track. I know that I believe C. Courtney Joyner does the commentary. So I suppose what we should do is fast forward to that point and see. It really doesn't make any sense for a movie that short. And, one of Universal's strategies following the Second World War was to, not produce B pictures, but to produce two quality shorter A pictures that they could sell together. And that explains why there are so many of these 80-minute Westerns in the Universal catalog in the 1950s. So, I really don't know. Eye strain, who knows?
Starring Rock Hudson as Taza, son of Cochise, fighting to lead the Apaches in the path of honor. Naiche, throw down your gun! While a vengeful Geronimo threatens revolt. Beautiful Barbara Rush, who stood by Taza against an angry father and the savage passions of her tribe. With Greg Palmer, the soldier who trusted Taza, and Bart Roberts, the brother who hated him enough to betray the Apache nation.
I wait only for Geronimo. When he returns with weapons, I will join him.
You never will. Not while I lead the Chiricahuas.
My second film is Giant, released by Warner Brothers in 1956. It was directed by George Stevens, who helmed the classic Western Shane 3 years earlier, and it stars Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and James Dean in the last of his 3 leading roles. The large cast also includes Dennis Hopper, Rod Taylor, and Mercedes McCambridge, to name just a few. Nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Giant earns Stevens his second Oscar for Best Director. The film is based on Edna Ferber's novel of the same name, and it's a sweeping Western epic about race and gender and the Texas oil boom of the early 20th century. More than living up to its title, Giant is a large canvas, multi-generational saga that spans several decades in the life of a wealthy American family. The story opens in 1922, with Hudson playing laconic Texas cattle rancher Jordan Bick Benedict, who arrives in Maryland to purchase a prize stallion from the Linton family. There he meets Leslie Linton, played by Taylor. She's a sensitive, intelligent, and idealistic young woman who speaks her mind and stands up for what she believes in. Naturally, Bick and Leslie fall in love, get married, and quickly head back to his 595,000-acre ranch. There, on the barren Texas landscape, we meet Bick's stern older sister, Luz, and a ne'er-do-well ranch hand named Jet Rink, brilliantly played by James Dean. I just love that name, Jet Rink. They really don't get better than that. Over the course of the film's nearly 3.5-hour running time, we watch as children are raised, siblings die, marriages are celebrated, wars are fought, grandchildren are born, and fortunes are made. The plot itself is too eventful to describe in full. Suffice to say that virtually every moment of Giant adds a new dramatic wrinkle to the Benedict saga. Personally, I love the massive size and scope of this film, and I find its ambition and its focus on important social issues to be really inspiring. Working with cinematographer William Meller, a 2-time Oscar winner, director Stevens fills Giant with some indelible imagery. From the towering Benedict mansion sitting all by itself on a vast empty estate, to a velvet couch loaded with a pile of Stetson cowboy hats during a memorial service, to a footprint in the mud slowly filling with oil. The sights that were shown in Giant are just impossible to forget. This is a gorgeous movie, overflowing with enough story to fill an entire TV series, which is good news since a remake of Ferber's novel is currently being developed for Amazon. Of course, the film also inspired the classic primetime soap opera Dallas, so I guess you could say that Giant and TV already go hand in hand. As for Rock Hudson, he grounds the action with a heartfelt performance. This is old-school Hollywood acting at its finest. Hudson captures Bick's frustration as the world changes around him. He's a conservative man who longs for things to stay the same as they always were in his family. But Leslie eventually opens his eyes to the discrimination that the Mexicans who work on his ranch face every single day. Now, Bick's change of heart isn't entirely complete by the end of the film, and his final lines of dialogue, though well-meaning, will definitely rub some modern viewers the wrong way. Still, there's no denying that Bick grows significantly throughout the course of Giant. Although James Dean steals every scene he's in and Taylor lights up the screen, in the end, Giant really is Bick's story. He's the one whose change of heart suggests hope for the future, and Hudson brings him to life with grace and honesty. It's no wonder then that the role earned him his only Oscar nomination. Seen today, Giant is more fascinating and relevant than it's ever been before. There are moments here, particularly when Taylor angrily chides a group of men for their boorish treatment of women, that seem extremely progressive for the time it was made. And there are countless poetic shots, like one of a small Mexican boy playing catch by himself at sunset while a funeral for a war hero takes place behind him, that have an uncanny power. I just find it remarkable how many complex issues this movie addresses while still being so incredibly entertaining. Of course, this being 1956, there are limits to how far Giant actually goes in addressing those problems, but there's a sincere effort here to face a number of real-world topics that I find quite striking.
I have mixed thoughts about Giant. I have to confess, and this has come up with a number of my friends, because this film is I think, beloved by many people. To me, it's never coheres in the way that I think it might. Initially it seems like it's going to be Elizabeth Taylor's movie as she, as you say, confronts the racism and sexism of the old boys club of Texas cattlemen. But it then does indeed become Hudson's movie, and he delivers a powerful performance. As for James Dean's performance, I think that his method acting more than sets him up as an outsider. There's times when to me it seems like he's in a different movie altogether. And there's a kind of heavy-handed symbolism throughout the film that I really find difficult to stomach. The film plays up its many oppositions using visual juxtapositions between East and West, men and women, American and Mexican, past and present. And these start from the very first shots of the movie and continue through to the very end. There are these meticulously staged compositions, often shot in depth, that play out in long takes, long enough to make sure that you see the juxtaposition and therefore know this means something.
Wow, I didn't know that was going to come. Yeah, it is a beloved movie. I remember my mom telling me about it as a kid. She was describing the plot to me. I thought it was probably, as a little boy, I thought it must be a movie about actual giants walking around.
How disappointed you must have been.
So when she would tell me that it was mostly about like cattle ranching and oil, I had no clue what that meant. But I knew that movie meant something to her, especially James Dean. She was sort of the first person who told me just how important he was. This really does capture the motto, they don't make them like this anymore. I watched the film for this podcast with my girlfriend, and the two of us were just transported watching it again. We've been talking about it for the last few days and how satisfying it felt to see a movie that, while heavy-handed, like you said, it definitely has that ham-fisted quality at times, it still just keeps giving you more and more. It's such a generous film. Like, it just keeps offering more cool things and more cool performances.
There is a lot in there. And I think it's an influential film. You mentioned the Benedict house alone out there on the plains, which every time I see that, I can't help think of Days of Heaven or countless other films with some giant mansion out in the middle of nowhere with workers in the fields.
Or Rebecca. That house always reminds me of Hitchcock's Rebecca, especially because there's a new wife coming into the house in both of those films, and there's already a housekeeper, in this case Big's sister, who's stern, just like in Rebecca. Yeah. So there are connections to other films there.
Well, there's a case to be made that this isn't really a Western. It's more of a family melodrama in the vein of the pictures that Hudson was making at this time. As you'll know, I'm something of a stickler when it comes to what films we call Westerns and which ones we don't, because I think there's something to be said for historical specificity. And this film is actually a great example. As you may know, Warner Brothers was afraid to associate the film with the Western genre in its advertising. So if you look at the original advertising, it doesn't indicate a sense of place at all. And the concern then was that if it was associated with the Western, one, the types of people they wanted to attract, the melodrama crowd, would stay away. And then the people who were interested in a Western would potentially be put off by the very overt treatment of racism and sexism. So it's actually an insight into the place that the Western proper occupied in cinema and culture at the time. In post-war period, Hollywood actually made a lot of what some people have called social problem films that directly addressed the issues that Giant does. So racism, race relations, and, often in regards to African Americans, but also Jews, Japanese, Hispanics, other groups. So films like Imitation of Life, Pinky, Gentleman's Agreement, Home of the Brave. And what's interesting is that those films exist at the same time as the pro-Indian movie of Broken Arrow or Seminole or Taza. So they emerge more or less at the same time. So you could say that they probably evidence the same strand of liberalism, but a key difference is that the issues the Western addresses are done subtly or maybe allegorically. So racism, anxieties around miscegenation, and so on. Those same issues were being addressed overtly in other films of the same period. So I think you contrast a film like Giant and its treatment of race to, I guess, a film like Seminole, and you can actually see why one is a Western and one isn't.
It is definitely overt here. There's no question about it. It hits it right on the head. There's also, though, a lot of humor in this film. That caught me off guard this viewing. We were laughing the whole time watching it. There's some great lines in there, some visual humor. I find Dean's performance really funny. There's scenes between him and Taylor at his ramshackle house on this little plot of land he ends up inheriting that are just great, watching him in the kitchen trying to make tea. He does a lot of physical business. He's such an interesting actor to watch. There's also a hand gesture he does at one point as he leaves a room that I've been trying to work into my own life now. Every time I leave a room, we'll see if anybody else notices.
All right, where he kind of does the smoothing out gesture.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's great.
This is Texas, mighty colossus of the Southwest, a land of infinite variety and violent contrasts, a land where today's ranch hand can become tomorrow's multimillionaire. But more than a state, here is a state of mind, manners, morals, emotions, of people who are often as exhilarating, exasperating, exciting as the land they belong to. Out of this fabulous and tempestuous panorama comes a story of magnificent scope and great personal charm. A cavalcade that spans a quarter century, of stormy passions, deep human understanding, and love. Always love.
Okay, Andrew, so what is your last film?
My last film is The Undefeated from 1969. Directed by Andrew V. McLaughlin, who we've discussed a couple of other times on the podcast and will no doubt discuss many more times. The film stars John Wayne as former Union Army Colonel John Henry Thomas, who, with his former troops, is leading a massive herd of horses to Mexico, the intent to sell them to Emperor Maximilian. Also headed south at the same time is former Confederate Colonel James Langdon, played by Hudson, leading his family and friends to Mexico in the hopes of establishing a new life there. Facing threats from all sides, the men and their parties eventually join forces. Released in November of 1969, 5 months after Wayne's Oscar-winning turn in True Grit, The Undefeated underwhelmed critics and underperformed at the box office. In the decades since, it has received little attention, and that includes by me. I wrote an entire book about Westerns from 1969 to 1980, and only mentioned the movie twice. If I could do it over, I'd pay more attention to this movie. The Undefeated is one of the last, if not the last, movies of its kind. An old-fashioned, large-scale journey western, gorgeously shot by William H. Clothier, and with a rousing score by Hugo Montenegro. It's part cattle drive, or horse drive, rather, part wagon train, part Anglos in danger south of the border. So every western from the 1940s through to the 1960s. The message is familiar and hopeful, emphasizing the common humanity of former adversaries. "See, they're just like us," says Langdon, observing the Yankees as they join his people to celebrate the 4th of July together. That a better future lies ahead is symbolized at film's end by the union of Blue Boy, Thomas's adopted Indian son, and Langdon's own daughter. The movie has a large, impressive cast with major stars at the head and a range of recognizable faces below them, all of whom receive meaningful attention from the story. Bruce Cabot, Ben Johnson, Harry Carey Jr., John Agar, Dub Taylor. The cast goes on, and again, each has his own shining moment. And that's to say nothing of the herd of 3,000 horses. Westerns of this scale became rare over the course of the 1960s. The risk was high and the reward, increasingly, was low. Notable failures include Cimarron, The Hallelujah Trail, Custer of the West, and The Way West, another McLaughlin picture we discussed in our episode on Kirk Douglas. All of which is to say that the odds were against The Undefeated, even with Wayne's bankable presence. It was Wayne who encouraged the casting of Hudson, and Hudson never forgot it, recalling years later, "John Wayne was then the Hollywood legend, and I was on screen with him. The guy is an angel. He saved my life back when no other filmmaker wanted to know me." As for Hudson's homosexuality, Wayne said, "It never bothered me. Life's too short. Who the hell cares if he's queer? The man plays great chess."
Well, that's a pretty good impression you got there.
Working on it.
Yeah. I'm kind of touched by that relationship between the two actors, and that Wayne at this point would invite Hudson onto this film. I think it was a very magnanimous gesture on his part, and I'm glad he did, because Hudson's really good here, especially in the scene when he lights his home on fire to prevent the carpetbaggers from taking over. There's a power there and a sadness to that performance that I think really, really comes through.
In that scene, you can't help but compare it to Gone with the Wind, because there's a similar scene before where a couple of carpetbaggers come and attempt to buy the plantation out from under him, but then to see him set fire to it is symbolically rich, to say the least.
And the color of that fire on this Technicolor film just looks gorgeous. It's shot at night too, so it really stands out beautifully.
Yeah, the Blu-ray of this film is really a marvel to behold in many ways.
I really love John Wayne's performance here. He's looser and funnier than I expected him to be, certainly more natural than he was, I think, in The War Wagon just a few years before, where he still seemed to be trying to sort of give us a John Wayne greatest hits performance. Here, he's just sort of like, I don't know, there's something natural about him. His late period acting in general took on a whole new dimension for me. He seems noticeably more comfortable playing his age. It's as though he's less concerned with capturing that John Wayne of old. And he's super funny, of course. I think people don't give him enough credit for that. The line when he's describing to, I forget who he's talking to, when he's telling them about what happened to his ex-wife and where she's gone, he says something like, she's living in Philadelphia now with her cat giving piano lessons. Yeah. And I thought, how did she go from sleeping in a sleeping bag on the range with John Wayne to, shacking up with her cat giving piano lessons?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And that's something I wrote about in Still in the Saddle, that there is a kind of marked transition from Wayne in the 50s and 60s, where he's really playing characters who are younger than he is. He's really too old to very quickly, and True Grit had a lot to do with this, acting his age, being comfortable with who he is. And all of his later films are filled with these, self-deprecating moments that, poke fun at his age and his girth, and, the suggestion that younger women would be attracted to him is incredulous. There really is a kind of easygoing charm that I think many critics miss.
It's also interesting that Wayne and Hudson don't actually meet up here until 45 minutes into the movie. It seems like a really long time. Yeah. We follow them on separate tracks, but it takes a while, and then they split up again for a while and come back together. But it does a good job of establishing those characters before they hook up with each other.
Yeah, that is something that rarely happens in movies. The idea that there are characters who are on parallel tracks and will at some point meet. The impetus clearly, and I understand this, there's a financial impetus to this. This is a screenwriter, to get those characters together and to let the sparks fly. But the payoff is great, because their initial conversation is so understated, but it actually crystallizes all of the commonalities that they have in these conversations that, ultimately ends with them having this more heated exchange that's punctuated by drinks of bourbon in between to temper the anger. It's really a great chemistry between the two of them.
Oh, definitely. The bourbon shots, it's so funny, that back and forth between the two of them. It does make you wish that they had done a couple more of these somewhere along the line. We also get a really outrageous Hal Needham free-for-all brawl in the middle of the movie, where like every character starts beating every character up. So I'm a sucker for those moments as well. When I mentioned the fire and the color of that fire, I don't know if Andrew McLaughlin gets enough credit for his work with the camera. The color here is so beautiful, especially in the costumes. We get Wayne's pink shirt with this gorgeous light blue scarf. You got Hudson's this red plume coming off of his hat that just strikes such a visual note against his gray uniform. There are the bright orange pants on the French horse soldiers. This movie just pops off the screen.
No, you're right. And there are some really brilliant compositions in this, which is, a credit to McLaughlin and also to Clothier. There's a shot early in the movie, and it's a high angle crane shot where, we start by seeing Union soldiers, and then they pass Confederate soldiers, and they start singing opposing songs. And as we kind of rise up, we see them walking past each other, but then in a cart, there are 3 African Americans who aren't characters in the movie, but it's just kind of summarizes the Civil War in a certain way. You know, you have these blacks there watching these 2 opposed forces walk by each other in opposite directions, and they're just sitting there. There's an intentionality behind those sorts of moments. And you don't expect to find that in a quote-unquote John Wayne Western.
From the bloody battlefields of the war between the states to the grim wastelands of Mexico, the defiant code of the undefeated made these 2 strong men bitter enemies.
Why did you come clear out here to continue a war that ended months ago in Virginia?
Because I'm a stubborn man. Does that satisfy you?
3,000 wild horses on a mad stampede of death and destruction across 2,000 miles of violence, ambush, treachery, and terror. John Wayne, Rock Hudson, battling it out toe-to-toe and side by side. Introducing Roman Gabriel, the great pro quarterback making his screen debut, and Merlin Olsen, all-star pro tackle.
Okay, Matt, so those are my 3 Rock Hudson Western suggestions. What is your third and final film?
My final title is Showdown, released by Universal Pictures in 1973. Written by young adult novelist Theodore Taylor and directed by Oscar winner George Seaton, who helmed the disaster classic Airport 3 years earlier. Showdown stars Rock Hudson, Dean Martin, and quirky actress Susan Clark, who's best known for playing Emmanuel Lewis's adopted mom on the 80s sitcom Webster. Hudson stars as Chuck Jarvis, a middle-aged sheriff in a sleepy New Mexico town who's forced to track down an old buddy of his named Billy Massey, played by Dean Martin. It seems that Billy robbed a nearby train with a few double-crossing partners, and now he's on the run. Chuck briefly ends up capturing Billy, then loses him again when he busts out of jail and heads for the border. But the 2 old pals meet up again and eventually shoot it out with Billy's greedy partners. Now, despite being made in 1973, Showdown is not a gory revisionist Western. Instead, it's a genial manhunt movie filled with low-key humor and stylized flashbacks that show how Billy and Chuck met and became friends. What makes Showdown interesting is that it's a film of firsts and lasts. It's the first Western that George Seaton directed, and it's the last movie he made as well. It's also the first time that Rock Hudson and Dean Martin co-starred together, and it's the last Western that either actor appeared in. I mention this because it plays into the film's theme of age and regret. This is a movie about remembering better times long since past. Both actors here lean into their status as aging movie stars, and the fact that they're slowing down is acknowledged frequently in the script. This, of course, mirrors what was happening in their careers at the time. They just weren't getting feature roles anymore. Other than some TV work here and there and a couple of Cannonball Run movies for Martin, Showdown really was the last hurrah for both men. Physically speaking, Dean Martin doesn't look very healthy here. He's puffy and bloated, and he doesn't move very easily. But in a way, that works to Showdown's advantage. There are moments here where Martin's vulnerability is almost heartbreaking. I especially love the quiet scene where he visits the grave of Hudson's young son, who he never met. It's an emotional pause in a film that's light on action and thrills, but better than its reputation would have you believe it is. Hudson has the thankless role here, playing a world-weary guy who's just trying to help a friend out of a jam while not ticking off his wife too much. But he's really good in the film, and the fact that you can sense a bit of desperation beneath the surface adds an extra layer of depth to the character. The flashbacks that appear throughout the movie help us see his sadness and disappointment as well. There's a melancholy note to this performance, and it feels authentic to me. As for chemistry between the 2 stars, there's none. Hudson and Martin seem more like acquaintances rather than close friends. Apparently they didn't get along very well in real life, and it's no surprise. But again, that distance between them occasionally works to the film's advantage, because this is, after all, a movie about drifting apart from someone you knew. Now, most of the complaints about the film have centered around its tired plot, and yes, there's no denying that we've seen this story many times before. But if you keep your expectations in check, you might be pleasantly surprised by what you find here. My suggestion is to see a bunch of other westerns starring Rock Hudson and Dean Martin before you see this one, because I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you do. Now, not to get too confessional here, but perhaps this is a film that's best appreciated if you're a man of, let's say, a certain age, and you're prone to looking back now and then on how it all went down. Perhaps then you might enjoy Showdown as much as I do.
Oh, that's great, Matt. I agree with all of that. You know, as I've pointed out many places, there are a lot of westerns like this from the late 1960s and the early 1970s, starring some of the aging icons of 1950s Hollywood who, as I said in the intro, found a kind of refuge in the Western, and were often able to do good work that had a kind of extra filmic resonance with their own careers, as if they were using the Western to reflect on who they had been and what they had meant, both individually and often together, given that pairing two stars is a common practice in the Western from this time. You know, in the previous segment, I talked about how Wayne, in the latter stage of his career, managed to avoid the trap of playing characters who were too young for him. And there's a little bit of that happening here. I think both actors are a little bit too old for their parts, as you know, these should be guys who are in their 40s. But instead they're a little bit older than that. Although there are more egregious examples out there of this in the 70s. I think the most egregious example actually is Martin's Rat Pack pal Frank Sinatra in Dirty Little Billy. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
It's a kind of it's a takeoff of Billy the Kid. It's a Burt Kennedy directed comedy. George Kennedy's in it, but Sinatra plays the Billy the Kid character, and he has a terrible toupee, and he's 30 or 40 years too old to be playing the part. So if that's the ceiling, you've got plenty of clearance, let's say. Another thing you mentioned that I really like about the film are the flashbacks. I think they're incredibly effective. And what I really like about them is the graphic quality of how they're introduced. So we cut to a still shot that looks like an image from an old newspaper, for example, that slowly fades to color and then comes to life. I wrote a lot about that kind of imagery in Still in the Saddle, where Westerns in the 60s and 70s would begin to invoke images that connoted history. So whether old, sepia-toned photographs or newspaper images. And I wish I had included this film, because this is actually a really sophisticated use of the technique. I agree that this is not the first Western you see. It's also not the last Western that you see, but it's certainly something you appreciate more when you're able to see it in the context both of how the Western developed, but also the careers of these two guys who have a long-standing relationship with the genre in different ways.
Those flashbacks really are pretty cool, aren't they? I love the way that they're triggered throughout the film. I start waiting as I'm watching it to see what's going to trigger the next one. It's usually something that one of the characters sees or hears. Sometimes they're really silly. Like at one point, Rock almost steps in a pile of horse poop and instantly flashes back to when he and Billy were little kids and they were throwing horse poop all over each other. It's such a funny little moment. It's just a detail. It doesn't add anything to the story, but it tells you a little bit about who these guys were when they were growing up. I mean, it's not a well-loved movie. It was hard to find any research online or reviews online that really embraced it. I'm a little baffled by that because I think there is something here that's really worth mentioning. I understand that the title doesn't make a lot of sense. Showdown. There's not a lot of showdowns in here. I've heard people say that, but really, who cares?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're talking about a genre where there's a film called The Tall T and nobody knows what that means, that's not really a great criticism. Yeah. Again, there are a lot of films like this out there that haven't got a lot of attention. And, Martin even made a number of Westerns towards the end of his career. A similar film, which I think is from a couple of years before this, is a film called Something Big, which is, also about a guy who reaches the end of his life and realizes that he hasn't had that something big that he had always been longing for and telling himself he was going to have, these kind of elegiac pieces, let's say. So there's a lot of Westerns out there to discover. So whether it's in the 1950s with Rock Hudson's early pictures or these sensitive later portrayals of men in changing times.
Drop it.
Chuck, I can get 3 shots off while you're trying to get 1.
Showdown. Get out of the way, Kate.
Looks like a holdup.
I'll always remember your generosity.
Once friends, now enemies. One sworn to uphold the law, the other to break it.
You held up a train, you fool.
Come on, that ain't friendly.
The most spectacular locations in the West, some of them above 12,000 feet, are the playground for this deadly, desperate game of hide and seek. One showdown after another.
Don't yell and back up.
Well, that about wraps things up for our Rock Hudson episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, and you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.